afternoon, good evening. This is Dove Tasman, and you're back on Equal Footing and back in studio. Love it. We bumped our programming again this week. The flow of current events forces it. What's going on right now in what we titled for tonight's program in our social media blast, The Great Powderkeg. The Powderkeg of the Middle East, particularly that corridor, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, is at risk of blowing up. Any moment, think the Israeli Defense Forces are expecting some sort of reprisal, a counterattack by Iran or its proxies in response to Mossad's assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, the successful elimination of Hezbollah leaders in Beirut, a not so long ago bombing of the Iranian embassy compound in Syria. There was a response before, there'll likely be a response again. We wanted to get ahead of that on the program and get insight from someone who's been on the ground in the conflict. Someone who has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. Gregory Brook is an 18-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He's a former director of operations for an international medical NGO. He's worked primarily in the special ops community. He's deployed and led combat as well as medical support teams in the Middle East and South America and even in the Ukraine. Greg led the first U.S. surgical support team in the Ukraine in March of 22, and the group that he's working with has maintained a constant presence. He's been a reservist. He's recently returned from a deployment to the Middle East. Can't talk a lot of that in detail. Is working, but we'll get a general sense, working in support of U.S. operations there. I do want to make clear, before I turn it over here, that Greg's views are his own. They don't represent those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force. Greg, welcome to Equal Footing.
Thanks so much, Dove. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see you, and to have an opportunity to answer some questions you may have. Again, I just want to emphasize that everything I say, my opinions and my views are my own. They do not represent the U.S. military, the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or the U.S. Air Force in any way, shape, or form. I'm here as a private citizen, and looking forward to answering your questions and hopefully shedding a little bit of light on what's going on in the region.
We're lucky to have you. I know it's a big... I mean, I don't know this. I assume it's a bit of a step outside of comfort zone because you probably get asked about this stuff all the time. But it's, not so often that you have, 75 or 100,000 people listening.
Right. It's very strange, right? So the world that I come from, there's a huge emphasis on, we have every day, it feels like I'm having a conversation about this with someone else who I work with or close friends who come from my world. So this is something I'm very, very comfortable discussing. I've never discussed it in front of an audience before in any context. It's probably helpful that I can't see any of the
Exactly. People. We're going to pretend there's no audience because then I can get away with really tough questions that I think are probably on the mind of a lot of our listeners around what's going on the ground. Because, if you believe what you read in the press, and I think it's true across all the different parts of the political spectrum, and you look at this high level of confidence, I don't know if that's the right word, Greg, but a sense that there's a very high probability, maybe that's a better way of saying it, that by the time a lot of people listen to this program, if they're getting it on their podcast platforms, there will have been some sort of counterattack.
There already has been.
Right.
Earlier today, about 3 hours ago, Hezbollah launched a fairly uncharacteristically large rocket barrage towards some targets in northwestern Israel. Thank God the Iron Dome, yet again, intercepted most of those rockets. There were no civilian casualties as far as I know. I was just taking a look at it before I came into the studio.
Walk us through for a moment over what's happened over the last 4 or 5 days, if people are not really in tune with the news cycle, that's brought this to a boil.
Right. God, there's so much. I mean, this all really started about 4 days ago now. No, less, 3 days ago. Where Israel, well, I guess the initial precipitation for this round of escalation happened with, Hezbollah says it was not them, but really it was. It's confirmed by Israel that it was. Hezbollah struck, the town of Majd al-Shams in, northern Israel.
Yeah, the Golan Heights.
Yes, in the Golan. Unfortunately killing, 12 primarily Druze children. Which was a significant escalation on the part of Hezbollah. To my knowledge, they haven't really targeted majority Druze communities because they also have a huge Druze population in Lebanon.
Yeah. Much bigger than Israel, actually.
Yes, about 800,000, I believe.
Yeah. Just as a tiny parenthetical, I don't want to have you lose your train of thought, but for listeners that may not be educated on this, did Hezbollah attack that Druze? It's a non-Jewish community, but there are Druze in the U.S. in the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yes.
There's a very strong relationship with the Druze community, with the Israeli government historically. Was that, in your view, a targeted strike, or was that an accident?
From the reaction, I would not assume it was a targeted strike. I mean, the thing you have to realize with a lot of Hezbollah and Hamas rocketry is it's not guided, or if it is guided, it's not guided to the standard that would be acceptable to any Western army.
Right.
I mean, their best guided rockets have like a 50% chance of hitting their target.
Okay.
At best.
So at that, this Druze village is hit. Children die in a soccer pitch. Then, sequence of events, is there any tying of that into the detonation of the bomb in Tehran that kills the Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas? Is that just a timing coincidence?
So, that's interesting. And there's a lot of intermediate steps there, right? So, the explosion happens in Majd al-Shams, which is a huge deal across the board in Israel. To the extent that Bibi Netanyahu canceled the rest of his trip to the United States. Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, flew back to Israel from the Paris Olympics. Netanyahu flew back. This is something that Israel has to answer.
Right.
And I mean, their response was, so the War Council meets, they develop a list of targets, and they took out Haj Hussein, Fuad Shakir, the second in command of Hezbollah.
And that's in Beirut, right?
In Beirut.
Right.
So
that's a rocket strike.
Yes, that was their first strike. That was, an airstrike.
And pardon my ignorance, I should have known this in the pregame research. How long after the strike on the Druze village does that take place?
I believe that was either 24 or 48 hours. And
so, again, I get to be the incognoscente here and ask all these.
Right, by all means.
I'm being greedy here with the information. In your judgment, and you've clarified this is just your own judgment, but you're an 18-year veteran, you've been on the ground there, you've seen it from different angles, both in support, special
I've done quite
ops.
a bit of this kind of targeting work as well.
Do you think that was a responsive strike to the
100%?
Okay.
I mean, they struck in Beirut, in the heart of the Hiyya, which is the neighborhood that is really the power center of Hezbollah in Beirut, in Lebanon.
Right.
The commanders live there. That's the part of Beirut that is, like, Hezbollah territory.
So the IDF had previously identified those locations, were ready to strike, and then after the attack on the Druze village occurs...
Not necessarily. So,
okay.
with high-level leaders in a lot of these organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis even, certain organizations, I mean, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all kind of like serious players in the Islamic terrorism game, they move around a lot. And they do that so you can't develop targeting lists to be able to hit them at will, because, I mean, obviously, if they wanted to, they could have hit, if that was the case, they could have hit Fuad Shakir at any point, right? And these people do practice a significant level of personal and operational security. I mean, Fuad Shakir has been wanted dead or alive since 1984, I believe, since the Lebanon, the Khobar Towers bombing in Beirut, which killed 324 U.S. Marines.
Yeah.
Or killed or injured 324 U.S. Marines, I should say. So like these people are not like just sitting around waiting to get hit. There's a lot of effort that goes into it, and these are typically what's called dynamic strikes, so they happen very quickly. To where there's typically a threshold of validation to where you say, okay, we have a reasonable level of confidence this person is in this building right now. And then there's other considerations. I'm not super familiar with the Israeli process, but typically it'll go through what they call their MAG. They're a military advocate general, which is basically like their lawyers to make sure that it's within...
Similar to what happens in the U.S. Armed Services.
Yeah, so it'll go through a several-step process to validate that this is a legal target, it's a legal strike, and then they will execute a strike package and send up an F-35 or whatever aircraft they're using, and they generally calculate like an acceptable level of civilian casualty rate here, right? So like with Fuad Shakir, given his rank and his importance, there was probably a significantly higher level of civilian casualty that would have been acceptable. But the Israelis often choose to strike in ways that will still minimize that level of casualty.
Right. There's so much to talk about here, Greg, and I want to give the audience the numbers to be able to pick your brain directly. I want to, though, close the loop on the potential responsive action. I say potential, I'm not sure if it was responsive, but the Mossad's assassination
of Haniya,
the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, which occurs, I guess, a little bit after that, maybe.
Less than 12 hours after, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now the news has come out even since we booked you on the show. Over the last, whatever it's been, 10, 12 hours, there's been a significant amount of news that was a bomb that was detonated in a safe house where Haniya would stay in Tehran, and that it had been smuggled in by Mossad some significant time ahead of time, like months ahead of time.
Right.
So what's going on there? Is that responsive to, or is that a coincidence of time?
So right now there's three leading theories for how Mossad did this. Or how the IDF did this. The first of which is the classical airstrike.
Mossad being the Israeli intelligence services, like equivalent to our CIA.
Yeah. Well, sort of. They're more like that's fairly accurate. It's a little bit different. The Mossad has...
More militarized?
It's one, more militarized, and two, they have different authorities and they can operate on Israeli territory as well.
I'm making a note, Greg, because I want to have you back on the show explaining that stuff.
Right.
But okay, go ahead. Yeah.
But in this context, in the past 24 hours, really, I cannot emphasize how unprecedented this is. An equivalent in the U.S. would be, at the inauguration, killing, the King of England as an invited guest of the terrorist American president. Yeah.
Right. So Haniya was a guest at the inauguration of the new Iranian president.
Right.
And then he basically goes back to his house and a bomb goes off. And
yes.
He and his bodyguard are killed.
Yes. Well, so that's the thing we don't know, right? So there's three competing theories right now, or four actually, that I've heard in the past, day and a half. The first of which is when Iranian news first released the information, they stated that it was a raid, which indicates a ground force attacked and killed Haniya, which would be incredibly embarrassing to the Iranian regime.
Right. And that's probably never happened before, Israeli forces inside Iran in a ground operation.
Oh, no, it has.
In Tehran.
Yes, multiple times.
Wow, okay.
So I can't remember his full name, but the chief of the Iranian nuclear program was gunned down literally in the streets of Tehran by a Mossad team.
Okay.
There have been other instances, I should say, where the Israelis have pulled off operations of a similar scale or magnitude.
By the way, I can't help myself. Do you think Mossad is kind of pound for pound more capable than our foreign intelligence services?
I don't really want to go in. I can't really say that one way or the other. Because it also depends.
They're certainly more intrepid.
I wouldn't even say that. The best clandestine operation is one that never sees the light of day. So
fair enough.
That's kind of a thing you have to consider. Also, they have very different goals in mind, right?
So is one of the goals maybe actually for it to be a visible operation, in still frame?
Oftentimes, yeah, right? Yeah. So that actually kind of supports the point I'm about to make. With the number of theories going on about how the Israelis were able to, how Israel was able to eliminate Hania, if you think about it, right, there's the possibility of a raid, there's the possibility of an airstrike, there's a possibility of a land-based missile, and then as of earlier today, there's the possibility of a long-term plan to eliminate him. All of those are terrifying to the Iranian regime for very different reasons.
Greg, I'm going to ask you to take a break.
Okay.
Just go to our first ad break. I want to give out the numbers here. We're with Gregory Brook. He's an 18-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He's been in special ops throughout the vast majority of his career. He's a combat veteran. He's been deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, South America, Ukraine, and other locations that he probably can't disclose. He was recently in the arena, in the region, performing special operations that probably is not going to be able to share in the show. He's a political and military analyst of the region. We're delighted to have him on here, and you can pick his brain too. There's two ways you can do that. You can call in live, 718-303-9090. That's 718-303-9090. We are back in studio, so a little bit will be quicker to the phone lines. And you can also text or WhatsApp a question in to a different number, or a comment if you like, 917-428-4062. Please don't call that number. This is just for texting or WhatsApping, 917-428-4062, and we'll be right back.
בהרים ריבו קרניים הם יולידו חופת שמש לכלולותיו פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש כאילו עם ומתחיל ללכת ולכל הנפגש בין
Equal Footing is about attacking the tough stuff. Nothing should be too difficult to address in our community. One of our sponsors shares that ethos, and it's Manhattan Medical. You've heard me talk about Manhattan Medical's work before around erectile dysfunction. It's nothing to be ashamed about. It affects 2/3 of men in their lifetime. Manhattan Medical utilizes a new effective therapy for ED. It's called Gainswave. It has enduring and permanent results for the vast majority of patients, and it has no side effects. It's surgery-free, it's painless, it's non-invasive. And most importantly, it's available to patients that have comorbidities and cannot take those expensive pills. So check out Manhattan Medical's Gainswave therapy for ED. I'm going to give you the number in a second. But before I do, note that if you tell them when you call that you heard about Manhattan Medical's ED treatment on this radio program, on the Dove Tusman Show or Equal Footing, you will get a free consultation. That's a $250 value. You do not have to be in Manhattan. You can be anywhere in the United States, in fact, and you can do a teleconsult and then get therapeutic follow-up. All right, here's the number from Manhattan Medical's ED Cure. The number is 888-ED-CURE-9. That's 888-332-8739. One more time, operators are standing by for Manhattan Medical's ED treatment. 888-ED-CURE-9 or 888-332-8739.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to. I've been told.
All right, so Greg, we're going to take our first caller in a second. I had a feeling this show was going to generate stir up some stuff. We've also got a number of text questions already. Let me make sure your mic is on there. We gotcha?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay, I think one of the questions that's on people's minds is, actually, you know what? Before I do that, let's bracket this thing about the Mossad operation in Tehran. But quickly, okay. I want to move to some more macro subjects. This operation set up ahead of time, coincidence, response to the attack in the Golan Heights?
Well, that's the thing, right? So there's a number of different possibilities here, right? That have all been reported very recently, to include the ground-based team, the airstrike, the ground-based attack missile, or the bomb that was planted. All of those have significant implications for the regime in Tehran, for very different reasons, and all of them are terrifying to the regime in Tehran for very different reasons.
Right. Which one do you think it was? I don't want to go too far down this road.
I'm personally of the opinion that it was an airstrike.
Okay. Even though there's a broad swath reporting today that it was a bomb detonated within the safe house.
Right. The reason I think the bomb is the least likely option is because the level of planning to assume that, like, unless we're now crediting the Israelis with possibly killing the former Iranian president, then setting up circumstances to where they knew that Hania would be staying at that specific guest house, planting a bomb, or perhaps using the situation as it happened to plant a bomb, or possibly responsibly planting a bomb within a short window of time once they were able to confirm that. That requires a significantly higher level of planning, not ability necessarily, but responsiveness. That, while it's not impossible, I think that's the least likely of the possible options. Also, the reporter who typically writes, or who broke the story in the New York Times, typically writes a lot of disinformation for the Iranian regime.
Interesting. It's funny. I thought it would be the opposite. The Mossad would want the story like that because it might instill.
Oh, of course. No, I mean the Mossad. They're never going to release a statement one way or the other.
Right.
So this kind of an operation also has the added benefit of kind of muddying the water and making people in Iran much more afraid of them. Right.
Right.
Also, you have to think about if it was a bomb planted, that suggests that there would have had to be someone fairly high level in the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, involved, which is also terrifying to the Iranian regime.
Sure.
But I mean,
let's take. I think we have a caller on line 5 that may have a question related to this.
Sure.
So let's take. I think this is Gary on line 5.
Yes. Hi. Good evening. God bless you both.
We seem to have lost Gary. Gary,
Sorry,
please
Gary.
call back. I'm sorry. In the meantime, I'm going to get to a question from a listener who asks about whether the Hamas commander. Now we're going back, I think, a month around this strike, Mohammed Deif.
okay.
And it was reported, I think, today or yesterday that the Israeli government reported that he had been killed.
Right.
And we do have Gary back on. We'll get him in a second. And just let me finish this listener's question. This listener asks, how do we actually know that in the case of Mohammed Deif or in the case of Ismail Hania, that they're really dead? It's a basic question I've often wondered as well. Like, who are we relying upon for that?
So there's a lot of different options there.
That's a listener named S.I.
A lot of times you'll rely on sources within either the organization that you're targeting or adjacent to them to run your confirmation, right? So, like, typically you can have trusted personnel saying that, or people that have proven themselves previously saying that, yes, this person is in fact dead. You can also see, like, difference in signals intelligence, other kind of monitoring to see if the people that would be talking to this person are still talking to them, or if there's disarray, or who's kind of running the operation now.
Because it would seem like it would be sometimes to the benefit of the terrorist organizations involved to say that someone's dead when they're not.
Right.
So do you think these folks that we're talking, I hate to say it so brusquely, but do you think these IDF and Mossad targets that we've talked about here, they were killed in Tehran and at the embassy in Damascus a little while ago and in Beirut a few days ago, do you think these are hits that have actually been that are real?
Typically I do. I think there is always some level of doubt. And we try, like, I can't speak for what the Israelis do. I've never been a part of the Mossad or any Israeli intelligence or military organization. But there are usually mechanisms to get confirmation. For someone like, in the case of like Mohammed Deif, for example, right, who was killed in Gaza, where the Israelis do have forces on the ground and are able to collect actual forensic evidence, they can do tests.
I see, because that's
confirm
part of a local military operation.
Right.
Let me see if I can get Gary back on. Gary, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Good evening.
Hi, welcome. Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, thank you. Okay, now what appeared to my mind when he brought that up about, to me, if it was a bomb planted and this Hamas leader is not very well liked by a lot of Palestinian Arab people as well. So what came to mind is maybe they worked with the Israelis to say, okay, he's going to be here, and we'll work together and we'll plant the bomb. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, Gary, let me
Let's
make
get
sure
rid of
I
this
have
guy.
your question correct for Greg. You're asking Greg
Yeah.
if in his professional estimation, it's possible that there was collaboration between the Israeli and the Iranian government on the Hania hit.
That's what came to my mind.
So hang on, let's
Let's
get Greg's
sure.
answer, and then we'll keep you on the line.
So,
Sure.
collaboration between the Israeli and the Iranian government, I absolutely don't think that happened. Collaboration between the IDF or the Mossad and elements within the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is, I mean, almost a shadow government. In Iran, they have a tremendous amount of power and a tremendous amount of latitude to operate. That is a possibility. There is a strong possibility that some element within the IRGC, for any number of reasons. I mean, this is just, again, my personal opinion and something I'm ascribing a lot of motivation towards. But I know that there are a lot of Iranians specifically who, I mean, we have demonstrations, we have proof of protests and riots against the Iranian regime. And I don't necessarily think that the IRGC is, like, immune to that.
Is there any collaboration in your view between in elements in Gaza? I mean, are there anti-Hamas elements that the IDF is collaborating with?
Yeah. We've seen riots against Hamas in Gaza that were, I mean, brutally suppressed. I don't know if you remember, but a couple of months ago there was a lot of footage circulating online of Hamas executing people they accused of collaborating with Israel. And, I mean, Israel does have, I mean, incontrovertibly a large number of collaborators in Gaza as well as in the West Bank as well. I mean, the Mossad incontrovertibly has very well developed, and Shin Bet as well, has very well developed networks of people helping the Israelis out in these areas. That's how they got Mohammed Deif. That's how they were able to orchestrate the raid on Shifa Hospital back in February, where, I mean, that was actually a very impressive raid where they got a large number of fairly high regimental commanders of Hamas units by making them think Shifa Hospital was safe, and then someone informed the Israelis that these people were all gathering and hiding there, and then they took them all out.
Notwithstanding all of the conspiracy theories that you've read in the press, the contrary. Everyone we've talked to, including other guests in this program, said that yes, that was definitely a hideout spot or
it was absolutely a military installation, yeah. Now, we know that. Greg, I mean, you can see that. Like, that's all publicly available information.
Right. And I think the IDF has done a pretty good job within the constraints, the obvious constraints of exposing, CNN and other reputable news sources to some of those things on the ground. I want to zoom out for a minute, because we've gotten a number of listener questions. I had some pre-prepared questions, Greg. When you see a counter response beyond the Hezbollah rockets from this afternoon, if and when we see a bigger response, do you think it's going to be a response that is just from Iran's proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, or do you think that there will be a direct military response from Iran like we saw in the rocket strike a couple of months ago in response to the Damascus embassy bombing?
I'm almost entirely certain it will be a direct response from Iran.
Okay. Follow-up question. Well, actually, so you think it's going to be a complete, quote-unquote, axis of resistance and Iranian response?
I mean, Iran is kind of the center of gravity. The axis of resistance also includes, like, China, Russia, North Korea, a few other countries. I don't think China or Russia are going to be launching missiles against Israel. I think Iran is kind of the center of gravity of Islamic terrorism in the Middle East currently. I mean, much more so than anyone else is. Every country currently attacking Israel is funded by Iran, provided material support by Iran, provided training by Iran. The IRGC is actively involved in all of these conflicts.
There's been speculation that the last time there was a rocket strike from Iran, that it was in a sense half-hearted, that Iran had to respond to the Damascus bombing, that they knew that the vast majority or not all the rockets would be taken down, that there might have even been some pre-warning around it. There's been some speculation around that in terms of Saudi involvement in taking down some rockets, et cetera, in Jordan. Do you think that if there is another strike, an imminent response, that it will have that dynamic to it? Or do you think it will be, in a sense, if that speculation is correct, let's just assume for a moment that Iran understood that it wasn't going to be a very successful military operation last time. Do you think this time they're going to be really out for blood? Or do you think it'll also, in a certain sense, be a show of force?
From my personal opinion, I think the circumstances motivating Iran to respond currently are significantly different from the circumstances in the Damascus attack that happened a few months ago, back in March. I would argue that right now, doesn't matter how the strike happened. The fact of the matter is that Ismail Haniyeh, who was, this gargantuan figure in kind of not just the Palestinian movement, but across the Islamic world as a figure of resistance against America and Israel, that he was the head of Hamas's political bureau. Like, this is not a small deal, right? Was killed in Tehran under the protection of the Iranian regime.
So it'll be a different level of response.
It exposes the Iranian regime as a lot weaker than they've been purporting to be. I mean, that's me showing up to your house, coming in there, and, there's a lot of colorful things I could say here that I'm going to refrain from saying because we're on live radio, but it's very embarrassing to them.
Right.
And it's shaming to them. And the Middle East is by and large an honor culture. So, they've just been publicly humiliated. They feel ashamed of what happened, and they have to respond in some way that they're going to try to save face effectively.
So this response is going to be a different order of magnitude, most likely.
Well, the last response was also quite significant in the fact, they sent hundreds of drones and hundreds of missiles. And, if it had just been Israel on its own, honestly, the Iron Dome is amazing. There are significantly advanced military technologies that Israel has that, Iran does not. But
they got help.
Yeah, they had from the U.S. and a bunch of Arab partners.
Right.
And that also, honestly, was shocking to everyone that watches geopolitics.
In a positive way, I think if you're looking at it from a pro-Israeli perspective. Greg, we've got to take our next break.
By all means.
Wonderful to have you on. We'll be right back with Greg Brook. He is a 18-year combat veteran. He's been in special ops in the Air Force. He's also worked on rescue support work, and he's been recently deployed in the Middle East. He's been on the ground at a lot of the places we're talking about. We'll be right back.
Equal Footing with Dove Tasman is sponsored by MDCS Dermatology, your experts in skincare. With 2 Manhattan locations and 4 offices in Long Island, including Plainview and Commack, the dermatologists and skincare surgeons at MDCS are proud to be affiliated with the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and New York Presbyterian Hospital. So schedule your next skin exam in one of MDCS's convenient New York area locations. To make an appointment, go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-DERM. That's 212-661-3376. You can even schedule a virtual video visit with MDCS's board-certified dermatologists from the comfort and safety of your own home. So go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-3376. And don't forget to mention Equal Footing for 15% off all cosmetic procedures.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to.
All right, back with Greg Brook, combat veteran, analyst of the Middle Eastern political and military situation. Greg, if and when we get this bigger response from Iran, several listeners have sent in questions about this. I share this concern. Does the U.S. get involved explicitly?
I have no idea. I don't think anybody really does outside of...
Give us the scenario.
A few people at the Pentagon.
Paint a quick scenario for us of how the U.S. military would get embedded in a next level conflict. How would it actually? What would be the catalyst? How would that happen?
What would be the catalyst? I would argue that. I mean, from my perspective, and again, this is me speaking as purely in a civilian context, I would argue that the U.S. is involved, right? The U.S. is already, the Dwight D. Eisenhower just completed its longest historical...
I think are we having an audio issue? All right. So, I think Greg's response was not heard. You know what we're going to do? We're going to get creative. We're here in studio. Okay. So, I was asking, until we get the signal from in the booth, I was asking whether the scenario painted where the U.S. gets involved explicitly, not just like helping bring down some rockets, but is now part of the conflict.
Okay. I wonder if... Yeah, I think you should be able to hear me now. Yep. In the context of whether or not the U.S. responds or how the U.S. responds, I think it will depend on the level of severity of what Iran does, how they use their proxies, which way they use their proxies, if it's a coordinated attack from a number of different proxies simultaneously, if that attack overwhelms Israeli air defense systems, what that'll look like is really anyone's guess. I know that earlier today, Netanyahu and Biden were specifically on a phone call that's being reported to discuss striking Iranian targets as a result of this major attack. I think the U.S. specifically does not want this turning into a major regional conflict. I would argue that Iran perhaps does now.
I want to follow up on that, and we've I think sorted out our audio issue here. So you hear this a lot in the press right now, Greg, that Lebanon and Israel do not want an all-out conflict in that part of the region. Now, I've never quite understood the logic, at least on the Lebanese side. I can understand on the Israeli side not wanting to fight on various fronts at the same time. But first of all, do you agree with that Lebanon and Israel, neither one want an all-out conflict on Israel's northern border and Lebanon's southern border? And secondly, to go to what you just alluded to, do you think Iran also wants to avoid a larger conflict at this time?
I don't necessarily think that Iran wants to anymore. I think that Lebanon, well, when you talk about Lebanon, you're talking about three different entities effectively simultaneously, right? You're talking about the Lebanese government, you're talking about Hezbollah, you're talking about, and also you're talking about the various factions that comprise the nation of Lebanon. Because again, you think about it, Lebanon has, 900,000 Druze as part of their population. They have a significant Christian population. They have a significant Shia population, which is mostly Hezbollah. And then you have a not insignificant Sunni population in the north of Lebanon that's, arguably more extreme.
I've been to Lebanon a number of times in a previous life, and at a media company, used to do business there, and I would go in not on my Israeli passport, but on my American passport. Look back on it, I think I was probably at risk and didn't realize it. But I remember once this must have been, late aughts, probably, and in Beirut, at a nightclub on a rooftop, I think it was called White, if I remember correctly. And there was a rocket strike in southern Beirut.
Right.
And the party went on.
Yeah.
And there was, with the group that I was with, which included a number of Christian Lebanese, but also... I guess they would probably they were Sunni.
They probably were Shia, but it depends. Beirut's primarily Shia.
Right, but
Muslims.
I think the southern Beirut, that area is almost entirely Shia, right?
Yes.
And I think, if I remember, because many years ago, but what I do remember is the group that I was with was not only nonplussed, they didn't feel that they needed to, even though the rockets couldn't have been more than, a couple miles away.
Right.
But they had faith in the IDF, surgical strike ability.
Right.
And they were also supportive.
Yeah.
There was literally a group of Lebanese business people that were supportive of the Israeli airstrikes going on a couple of miles away in a different neighborhood of Beirut. So people don't, your point is obvious to you and those who are in this arena, but many listeners I don't think realize that, Hezbollah being in Lebanon doesn't mean
they have the broad support of the Lebanese population. No, they don't. I was on Instagram 2 days ago, and I follow a lot of very anti-Israel, very anti-Western accounts, just kind of like understand more than anything else. And there's one person in particular that was posting something, and she's Lebanese, posting something basically deriding the fact that half of Lebanon doesn't care about the fact that Israel struck in the center of Dahiyya, right? And she was excoriating her followers to, resist the Zionist aggressor and the Zionist entity and all this. But I mean, your average Lebanese person can go one of two ways, right? Like, if they're Shia, they live in South Beirut, their odds are they really care about this.
And
a lot of Lebanese people.
Hezbollah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then there's a lot of Lebanese people that don't.
Right.
I've spent a lot of time in Beirut. I love the city. It's beautiful there. I have a lot of Lebanese friends. And the majority of them are very removed from this conflict in a way that I think a lot of other Muslims aren't, or other people in the region aren't. Lebanon's always also been a very cosmopolitan place.
Unfortunately, less so than it used to be.
Right, especially now. But
let's go back to Iran for a moment. And so you seem to be a little bit of bucking the trend in at least in like the groupthink that Iran actually might be politically, or at least the regime might be politically inclined or favorable towards a live conflict directly with Israel.
I think
more all-out war.
I think
not a proxy.
That Iran specifically, while it doesn't necessarily want an all-out war with Israel, especially right now when Israel has demonstrated a capability to strike in the heart of Iran, I think that they've been engineering the situation for the past year for several different reasons, and in several different ways to try to weaken Israel. And everything they've done has actually almost had an opposite effect, right? So, I mean, you look at it from a strategic perspective. Israel is, whether or not it was Israel acting alone or with help from the IRGC or via airstrike or ground strike or raid or whatever, they took out the head of Hamas's political bureau, right? I mean, this is literally the face of Hamas, right? Ismail Haniyeh. And Hamas didn't respond. There haven't been rocket attacks from Gaza.
Right.
And the reason there haven't been rocket attacks from Gaza is because Israel has, almost entirely eliminated Hamas's ability to wage war. Right? Like, we did not see any major rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel because they can't. They certainly want to.
Has Iran's war capability been affected or reduced at all by its provisioning of technology to Russia?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it has.
Pardon my ignorance, they've been like giving stock, basically inventory stock.
Yeah.
Drones and rockets.
Yeah. So Iran has been providing Shahed drones to Russia, to prosecute their war against Ukraine. And you can only replenish that so fast. And then they also used a significant portion of their drone stockpile to attack Israel a few months ago, and none of those made it because the U.S., Jordan, Saudi Arabia, other nations helped the Israelis knock everything out of the sky.
We have a question from Ellie in Brooklyn,
sure.
Who is creating a comparison. I'll just say it directly. Is there a comparison to be made between the perceived might of Iraq prior to the second conflict, in particular of the Iraq War, and the perceived military might of Iran now? Is it an emperor with no clothing?
I think it's a very hard question to answer.
Just to put it in context, especially for very young listeners, I remember this very acutely. I was around in 9/11 and the after response, and I went to Iraq, not as a service person, Greg, but working in that same media company, working with the U.S. government in 2004, 2005, and there was this massive overestimation of Iraq's military capability.
Right.
There was a sense that people were talking about there could be a world war, that the U.S. could, end up having, be dragged into another Vietnam, and obviously, both conflicts were pretty quick now, the occupation after. So there's
that's
a lot more to talk about.
Right.
But could it be that Iran, you said it's complicated, but at a super general level, if you had to press if you were in a game show,
right,
and you had to press yes, we're overestimating Iran's military might, or no, we're not, which button would you press?
For Iran, I don't think we are.
You don't think?
when you describe military might, that's also a very kind of like broad statement, right? Like, I mean, if you're asking me if Iran has a comparable capability to the 11 aircraft carriers that the U.S. does, no one does, right? If you're asking me if Iran is capable of fighting a defensive war in their own country, I absolutely believe they do. I also absolutely believe that they would be a much harder fighting force to defeat than the Iraqi army, for a number of different reasons, not least of which is
ethnic unity in part. Right?
Well, I mean, the IRGC is a legitimately good fighting force. They are well-trained, well-provisioned, well-supplied, a huge number of them. I mean, we can have these debates about whether or not there's elements in the IRGC that don't support the current Iranian regime, and certainly that's the case, but, I mean, there's a lot of daylight between not supporting the current regime and fighting off what you believe to be an existential threat,
right,
in the context of, like, an invasion of Iran.
We're going to be right back. We're here with Greg Brook, who is a combat veteran, 18 years, Special Ops Forces, Air Force veteran, and just an amazing font of insight on what's going on in the Middle East. Greg, I haven't mentioned earlier in the show that you're Jewish.
Yeah.
And your name wouldn't necessarily give it away. And I want to ask you after the break a question or two on that.
Sure.
In terms of, because I know it's a small minority of the American armed forces that people in uniform that are Jewish, and that must give it an interesting tenor,
right,
as you've been deployed in the region. And I also want to ask you about Saudi, or Yaakov in New Jersey, and others want to ask you about Saudi.
Sure.
We'll be right back on Equal.
Of course.
Rise up, rise up. Kuma tonight. Kuma tonight. Kuma.
Equal Footing has been brought to you for years by Mechanical Art Capital. Mechanical Art Capital is a simple business. If you are a watch dealer or a jewelry dealer or a watch collector, you can get financing practically overnight for your inventory or collection. It's halachically sound. You're not getting a loan. You're getting an inventory financing program at really reasonable rates, and you can buy back your collection or your inventory at any time. Check it out. On your smartphone, put in 3 words in your app store, Mechanical Art Capital. You can also go to their website, mechanicalartcapital.com. You just upload a couple of photos or videos, your watches. You get a financing offer practically immediately, and you can have cash in your pocket the next day. Mechanical Art Capital.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to. And I've been told.
Greg, Yaakov from New Jersey asks whether the Israeli-Saudi peace deal, is it still in the works? Has it been derailed by the events in the Middle East recently? And will Saudi intervene on Israel's behalf if Israel goes to war with Iran?
So that's
what's amazing, Greg? I'm sorry
to
interrupt. The fact that question can even get answered. Could even get asked.
Absolutely.
I mean, can you imagine 4 or 5 years ago someone asked, would Saudi intervene on Israel's behalf in a war? I think it's just great that we're even at the point where that's a consideration. But sorry,
right. No, I mean, it is. It legitimately is a sea change in Middle Eastern political affairs and relations. Regarding the first part of that question, I think that demonstrably, even though it's not been stated as moving forward, what Yaakov was referring to, of course, are the Abraham Accords, instituted as one of kind of the last real policy accomplishments of the Trump White House. That was primarily spearheaded by Jared Kushner, actually. The Abraham Accords were an amazing achievement. I mean, I honestly believe that if that had been an achievement of the Obama White House prior to Trump, that would have been something that, CNN and MSNBC would still be talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people do not give the Trump White House enough credit for that. That was legitimately that was a victory. An incredible victory.
So does Saudi intervene?
Well, I think October 7th was actually a direct response to those accords. because
Iran was concerned that there was a peace agreement going to be imminently announced.
yeah, I mean, Iran sees itself as being kind of ostracized from the Middle Eastern power, or from having power within the region by Saudi Arabia. But I mean, I guarantee you that like the Iranian regime is most afraid of a Saudi-Israeli alliance. Those are the two main powers in the region in a lot of different ways, right? Especially considering the level of financial ability that Saudi Arabia has.
Saudi is primarily Sunni, and
yes,
Iran is primarily
I mean, specifically, they're not primarily, they're almost 99% Sunni Muslims.
Having lived in the Gulf, you've spent a lot of time there as well. It won't sound as odd to you as it will to some listeners to hear that often the antagonism or hatred that's reserved between Sunni and Shia is sometimes greater than the feeling that you'll hear in the Gulf, at least, against Israel.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
greater what's the word I'm looking for?
Antagonism.
Antagonism or antipathy with the Shia population.
Well, I mean, the difference is, like, if you're a devout Muslim and you're a devout Sunni, you think that Shia are heretics. If you're a devout Shia, you think that Sunni are heretics. And it's kind of the hatred
and
that's
Jews
reserved.
are not part of either.
Right. I mean, like, we're similarly people of the book. There's just a feeling that, like, you know, the Zionist entity is an aggressor, that we're usurpers.
It's more of a political and territorial issue than it is a religious issue per se.
I mean, I think there's a lot of religious antipathy towards the Jews in the Gulf, but I think it's kind of like, you know, you hate Jews because your parents hated Jews because their parents hated Jews. It's a lot less of a direct experience.
And frankly, we talked about this in the show before. My great uncle was in early uprisings against the British in Palestine, and fought early on alongside Muslims. So, really, it's only maybe going back 4 or 5 generations, not 20. Greg, we're going to run out of time, and I got to get a couple of other questions.
Sure.
Several listeners have asked about the political environment in the United States, and you know from some of our pregame discussion prior to the show, I had that question as well. Without getting too partisan, what is your very high-level view of differences that might exist for Israel under prospective Harris administration and under prospective Trump administration?
So this is interesting, right? I think recently President Biden has received a lot of criticism, and I'm not going to comment on whether or not it's fair or anything like that, for not being as overtly supportive of Israel and of also simultaneously trying to support the Palestinian people in Gaza. I don't necessarily think that's fair. You know, the U.S. has never cut off any kind of arms support or material support to Israel. There's clearly a lot of intelligence sharing going on. We kept a carrier strike group well past any historical deployment length in the Mediterranean, specifically to counter Houthi targeting of shipping, as well as to help in the defense of Israel. I don't know what a Harris White House would look like. I'm not particular. I don't even know if she has specific policy positions on Israel currently. I know that her last statement condemning the Majid al-Shams bombing, kind of in a departure from tone of the Biden administration previously. Her specific statement, kind of as, I guess, the Democratic frontrunner, even though the DNC hasn't happened yet, it did not, you know, mention Islamophobia or any of the other things that have previously been mentioned in a lot of Biden's press releases.
Yeah, it seemed a little bit more pro-Israel, frankly.
Right.
Yeah. And there's some scuttlebutt. We got to do a different program on this.
Right.
Knowing some people that are involved with that campaign, there's some scuttlebutt that there's more of a personal affinity for Israel with Kamala Harris than there may have been with Joe Biden, which is quite ironic and very different to what we hear in the press. I want to do some rapid fire questions.
Sure.
There's some great ones that have come in. From
Let's do it.
First of all, I want to give props to Dan, who opines that you're wrong. I don't know if he actually opines you're wrong because he didn't ultimately make a definitive statement, but he thinks there's zero chance that Saudi would ever intervene on behalf of Israel.
I mean, they already did.
That's right, Dan. They already did in the case of the rocket strike.
Yeah.
Whatever it was in March or April. Okay. A couple of other listener questions here. One is, how do you predict, Greg, that the future of, let me simplify because we have almost no time here. When will the war in Gaza end, Greg?
I have no idea how to even answer that question. I would say when Israel believes that they have achieved their goals. One of those goals
Are we
is...
talking a month, a year, 2 years?
I mean, it's really hard to say. If their goal is the elimination of Hamas's ability to achieve war, to wage war against Israel, they have, to some extent, achieved that. I see an active or an official end to hostilities kind of probably being precipitated by the elimination of Yahya Sinwar, perhaps. I think the war in Gaza will end when Israel decides it does, at this point.
Next question. Do you think Netanyahu will continue to be in power after the conflict in Gaza ends?
That is a very difficult question to answer.
Maybe not a fair one for you. You haven't positioned yourself as an expert on Israeli politics.
I mean, Israeli politics are wild, for lack of a better term. I think that Netanyahu is a lot more popular right now than he was at the start of this conflict, certainly. I think a lot of that depends on how this conflict ends, when and what the state of Israel is, or what state Israel is in at the end of it.
I wish I could ask you these as over-unders, like we were creating big
right, like, yeah.
lines. And I love the
3-to-1 odds. I give 3-to-1 odds on Netanyahu being in power. I don't know.
By the way, I got another real-time response here from our listener, Dan, who says, that the U.S., it was different in the last intervention because it was the U.S. being allowed to use Saudi airspace. Not sure he's right on that. I think there was actually Saudi rockets as well.
There wasn't, Saudi air defense didn't particularly play a role. It was much more so than the U.S. being allowed to use Saudi airspace. It was the Saudis giving real-time intelligence to Israel, which...
Got it. Okay,
so I think may have been the first time that happened in that context.
Yeah, there was a lot of reporting that it was.
Right.
Dan, for what it's worth, thinks BB is in for the long haul. All right, I want to ask you about Jewishness.
Okay.
Being in the military. You've been in the military for 18 years.
Right.
And even now you're a reservist, but you work with the U.S. military still in what you do in your private life.
Right.
How does it... Let me ask this. Do you feel it's somewhat... First of all, how rare are you? I mean, what percentage of the folks that are on the ground deployed in this region within the U.S. Armed Services are Jewish?
I mean, I don't know, like, numbers off the top of my head. I can say at deployed bases, a few of them have, like, Shabbat service, especially, like, the bigger bases. So, like, I'm not going into names. When there's, like, large concentrations of U.S. forces, there's usually, like, probably, like, I don't know, the most I've ever seen was like 15 Jews in one place. Do
other service people look to you in a sense for some sort of ethical or moral guidance on what's going on in the region as a Jew?
No, not any more so than I think they do looking at me as like a ranking service member, or someone that has a lot of experience. I don't think I've ever, like, used a statement like, as a Jew, I think, X, Y, or Z.
Do you think you're at more risk as a deployed Jewish service member in the region?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so, necessarily. I mean, it depends on who you're fighting, when and where. When I was involved in the conflict in Syria against ISIS, we would often joke, like, yeah, you'll know when they catch me because of the size of the bonfire.
Oh, God forbid. Greg, this has been so great to have you on. I would love to have you on again once some of this stuff is played out and have us reflect back on, some of the predictions, some of the discussion. I really appreciate you being on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And thank you for all your listeners for listening. I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer all their questions to the fullness. I mean, this is a very complicated topic and there's so much to say on it.
We'll do the over-under betting line on
Instagram.
Yeah.